Everyone says the 1990s were peak Mercedes, the era of indestructible sedans built like bank vaults. But the 2000s, that's when Mercedes engineers looked at all that restraint, threw their coffee on the table and said, let's see how far we can push this. This was the decade when luxury turned into an obsession, when technology, power, and ego collided under the same silver star. Every model was a science experiment, a mix of genius, madness, and occasional mechanical heartbreak. So today, we're counting down the most over-engineered Mercedes of the 2000s, the cars that defined this wild decade of brilliance and chaos. Machines so complex that even Mercedes mechanics probably needed therapy after working on them. And trust me, by the end, you'll understand exactly why the 2000s changed Mercedes forever. Our countdown starts with a machine born out of corporate daydreams and Formula One ego, the Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren. The story begins in the early 2000s. Mercedes owned 40% of McLaren, and together they were dominating F1. Someone in a meeting asked the dangerous question, what if we built a road car together? On paper, it sounded perfect. Mercedes would bring the money, the luxury, and the marketing. McLaren would bring the carbon fiber magic and race-bred engineering. What could go wrong? Well, everything and nothing at the same time. The SLR was powered by a 5.4-liter supercharged AMG V8, hand-built, delivering 617 horsepower and 575 pound-feet of torque. 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds, top speed 208 miles per hour. Numbers that made Ferrari nervous and Porsche sweat. But the real madness wasn't under the hood. It was everywhere else. The car looked like a fighter jet fused with the classic 300 SL gull wing. It had butterfly doors, side exit exhausts that could literally roast your ankles, and an active air brake spoiler that popped up during hard stops like a mechanical parachute. It was equal parts artwork and overkill. Inside, Mercedes refused to forget comfort. Heated seats, navigation, cup holders, and a 5-speed automatic transmission. Yes, a 5-speed auto in a 200-mile-per-hour supercar, because why not ruin McLaren's day just a little more? The result was a car that didn't fit anywhere. Too refined to be a raw supercar, too ferocious to be a grand touring cruiser. One moment, it wanted to sip champagne. The next, it wanted to set the Autobahn on fire. Reviewers were confused, owners were obsessed, and McLaren's engineers probably needed a drink. Still, the SLR remains one of the boldest collaborations in automotive history. A $500,000 statement that proved Mercedes could out-engineer anyone, even if it meant outsmarting themselves in the process. But that was just the beginning, because Mercedes wasn't done showing off what happens when innovation goes a little too far. Imagine it's 1998. The legendary W220 E-Class, the car dictators and diplomats adored, had finally retired. That car was so overbuilt, even the doors sounded like gun safes closing. But Mercedes knew times were changing. They wanted something sleeker, lighter, more futuristic. Enter the W220 E-Class, the modern S-Class that would carry the brand into the new millennium. And at first, it looked like a masterpiece. Critics called it the most advanced car on Earth. It introduced airmatic air suspension, radar-based Distronic cruise control, keyless start, massaging seats, and the revolutionary pre-safe system, tech that could sense an impending crash and prepare the cabin automatically. It was like driving a crystal ball. But here's where the crystal cracked. Behind the glossy technology, Mercedes was quietly cutting corners. The Daimler-Chrysler merger had given accountants a little too much say, and suddenly, German precision met corporate cost-cutting. Owners soon discovered rust, not just cosmetic, but creeping into wheel arches, trunk lids, even structural components. Then came the airmatic nightmares. Compressors failing, sensors dying, suspensions deflating overnight. More than one owner walked outside to find their 6-figure luxury car squatting in the driveway like it had given up on life. And if that wasn't enough, some systems stayed active even after the car was turned off, draining the battery completely. It was so dedicated to engineering perfection that it literally engineered itself into exhaustion. By the mid-2000s, the W220 went from best car in the world to a Consumer Reports cautionary tale. For Mercedes, once synonymous with bulletproof reliability, this was humiliating. But instead of retreating, they doubled down. They handed the keys back to the engineers and said, "Go wild," and that's exactly what happened next. Now this one wasn't just over-engineered. it was weaponized. The SL65 AMG Black Series looked like a standard SL that spent a few years locked in a gym, surviving on nothing but protein shakes and bad decisions. AMG took the elegant roadster and said, "Let's remove everything civilized." Out went the folding roof, replaced with a carbon fiber fixed top. They widened the body, added flared fenders so muscular they looked angry, and finished it with a rear diffuser that could double as an air intake for a jet. Under the hood, a twin-turbo 6.0-liter V12 hand-built to produce 661 horsepower and a mind-melting 738 pound-feet of torque. That's torque so brutal it could twist your spine if you weren't ready. 0 to 60, 3.6 seconds. Top speed, just over 200 miles per hour. But the true insanity wasn't just in power, it was in precision. AMG gave it a fully adjustable coilover suspension, wider tracks, and a 3-stage stability system that let you decide exactly how much danger you wanted. And in typical Mercedes fashion, they paired all this fury with a 5-speed automatic. Because of course they did. Every panel was bespoke carbon fiber. Every part screamed aggression. Only 350 units were ever made, instantly turning it into a myth. The Black Series wasn't about practicality or comfort. It was a flex, a declaration that Mercedes still knew how to build monsters. It didn't care about emissions, price, or reason. It was the last car that said, "We can, so we will." But not every over-engineered Mercedes was about horsepower. Some were about showing the world just how complicated luxury could become. The early 2000s SL-Class looked like the future on wheels. Sleek, graceful, and full of magic tricks. At the push of a button, its steel folding roof would elegantly disappear into the trunk. It was the perfect hybrid of coupe and convertible. Except it wasn't always so perfect. That beautiful dance was powered by a hydraulic ballet of pumps, valves, and actuators, each one synchronized like a Swiss watch. If even one decided to misstep, the entire routine stopped mid-air. Owners would be left stranded in parking lots with their roofs half open, looking like a transformer having a breakdown. Then came active body control, or ABC, a suspension system so advanced it used hydraulics and sensors to keep the car level through every corner and bump. When it worked, it was like gliding on a cloud. When it didn't, it was like riding a malfunctioning amusement park ride. Leaks, pump failures, and fluid contamination turned repair bills into horror stories. Mercedes engineers even over-engineered the drainage system, ensuring rainwater didn't flood the electronics, unless the drains clogged, which they often did, right above the control modules. Inside, the SL was packed with electronic seats, ventilation fans, massage systems, and dozens of control modules, each capable of throwing its own tantrum. It was luxury with a price, the kind of car that could cost a fortune before it even left your driveway. Still, when you drove one, none of that mattered. The SLR 230 looked like a supermodel and felt like a spaceship. It captured the very essence of Mercedes's early 2000s philosophy. If it's possible to make it more complicated, do it. But as the SL was dazzling the world, Mercedes was quietly plotting redemption, and their next experiment would bring the over-engineering obsession to a family sedan. By the mid-2000s, Mercedes had a problem. Its smaller cars had a terrible reputation. The previous generation, the W203, was plagued with rust, cheap plastics, and unreliable electronics. It was the car that made people whisper, "Mercedes is slipping." So, when it came time for a replacement, Mercedes basically said, "Fine, let's overbuild everything." The result was the W204 C-Class, a car engineered like it were preparing for a war. Its structure was made of 70% high-strength steel, giving it a chassis stiffer than some sports cars. It came standard with 7 airbags, an ultra-rigid front end, and suspension geometry so advanced that most drivers would never notice. But engineers would drool over it. This was Mercedes saying, "We're sorry," and backing that apology with industrial-grade steel. The electronics were completely redesigned. The materials finally felt premium again, and for once, things actually worked. Even the command infotainment system booted reliably, a small miracle in early 2000s Mercedes world. And then came the C63 AMG. While BMW's M3 was showing off with inline-6 finesse, Mercedes just dropped a 6.2-liter naturally aspirated V8 under the hood, 451 horsepower in a compact sedan. It was excessive, It was loud, it was unnecessary, and it was perfect. The C63 wasn't just a car. It was an apology letter written in tire smoke. It said, "We know we messed up. Here's 450 horsepower to make up for it." The W204 marked Mercedes' return to overbuilding for pride, not profit. It was engineered to last, to silence critics, and to remind the world that the star on the hood still meant something. But while the C-Class was regaining trust, the engineers at Stuttgart were busy crafting one final masterpiece, the car that would define everything good and bad about Mercedes' obsession with perfection. This is where Mercedes' over-engineering obsession hit its ultimate peak. After the disaster that was the W210 E-Class, notorious for rust and failure, Mercedes gave its engineers a blank check and a mission: build the best sedan on earth. They spent $2.2 billion just developing it. Not on marketing, not on racing, just the engineering. The result was the W211 E-Class, launched in 2002, a car that felt more like a rolling laboratory than a family sedan. Let's start with the brakes. Most cars use simple hydraulics. You push, fluid moves, wheels stop. Easy. Mercedes said, too basic. So they created sensotronic brake control, a brake-by-wire system where the pedal talked to a computer, and the computer decided how much pressure each wheel needed. When it worked, it was genius, smooth, precise, even gentle enough to keep passengers from spilling their coffee. When it failed, the repair bills could make grown men weep. Then came the airmatic suspension with computer-controlled ride height and firmness. In comfort mode, it floated like silk. In sport mode, it stiffened up like a track car. You could raise the car for rough roads or lower it for aerodynamics, all at the push of a button. And it wasn't just comfort. The W211 was stuffed with pre-safe Distronic Plus Cruise, attention assist fatigue monitoring, active brake assist, and even intelligent headlights that adapted to oncoming traffic. It was the safest, smartest, most complicated Mercedes ever made. And under all that tech were bulletproof engines like the E500 V8 and the E320 V6, proving that even buried under 10 computers, Mercedes could still build mechanical excellence. But that complexity had a cost. Sensotronic brakes were so troublesome that Mercedes had to recall thousands of cars. Repairing an airmatic system could cost more than a semester of college. The more advanced it was, the more fragile it became. Still, enthusiasts look back at the W211 as the last truly overbuilt Mercedes sedan, the point where craftsmanship, technology, and insanity met in perfect balance. It was the last time Mercedes engineers were allowed to build something purely because they could, not because the accountants said they should. And that, right there, was the 2000s, a decade where Mercedes went from unbreakable tanks to high-tech thrill rides, from bulletproof simplicity to over-engineered brilliance. The SLR showed the world that luxury and lunacy could coexist. The W220 S-Class taught Mercedes a hard lesson about perfection. The Black Series proved that power still mattered more than reason. The SLR 230 showed how complicated elegance could get. The C-Class W204 restored the brand's soul. And the W211 E-Class? It closed the chapter on an era that will probably never be repeated. These cars were wild, flawed, and unforgettable. They broke rules, budgets, and occasionally themselves. But that's exactly why people still love them today. Because sometimes, greatness isn't about getting everything right. It's about daring to go too far. And Mercedes, in the 2000s, went way too far.